class, for this week's video, I'm actually going to combine the lecture video as well as the assessment video. So I'm going to combine the two of those. Since you don't have two assignments for this week, you only have one, I feel like that it will be better to have one longer video as opposed to the two sort of shorter videos. So to start off, we're going to start with the lecture for this week. And this week we are really looking at the emergence of the Atlantic. And when we talk about the Atlantic in this class, we're really talking about and delving into the idea of this Atlantic world and what that means. We're thinking about places off the coast of Africa, the Americas, and Europe, and we're thinking about the ocean that lays between them. For this particular section, we're really going to be looking at Europeans and why they are the ones who are exploring in the Atlantic. So in previous weeks, we have looked at things like the Black Death, the Crusades, trade, and changes in the European economy. And because of this, we have come to the conclusion that Europe was in a way uniquely situated to enter into the Atlantic world. Today we're going to look at other reasons why Europeans were eager and able to explore the Atlantic. We will return to this particular slide at the end, and we will talk a little bit more about each of these individual bullet points that I have up here. But for now, I just want you to keep these in mind as we move forward to try and ask yourself, why Europe as opposed to someone else? The first group of explorers that we're going to talk about today are going to be the Norse. So from the late 8th century, Vikings had looted and terrorized the coastal peoples of Ireland, Britain, France, and Spain. Often poor and land hungry, they landed and settled in Iceland, the British Isles, and France. Eric the Red created the first settlement in Greenland. His parents had been banished from Norway for killing, and he was later banished from Iceland for the very same reason. His family and friends went with him, and he sailed west to the southeast coast of Greenland. At this time, Greenland had a somewhat warmer climate, safe anchorages, good pasturage, and an abundance of land. Announcing these advantages, he encouraged others to join him. There was an extensive mass of people that went to join Eric the Red, and there was also extensive trade between Greenland, Iceland, and Norway. Trade is something that drives a lot of exploration, and I think it's important to note here that while trade didn't necessarily lead to this exploration, trade is something that is still going to continue and be very prominent in cultivating different regions. In addition to that, the Norse discovery of North America was also an accident of overshooting. So Bjarne Harfinsson learned that his father was in Greenland and set out from Norway to go and find his father in the early 11th century. A wind drove him southwest until he made landfall. He coasted north and realized he was on an island, and then turned and sailed north, and in a few days he found land with mountains and glaciers that was not Greenland. While he didn't stay and settle, he later returned east, and he had sort of talked about the different places that he had discovered. Eric the Red later commanded his son, Leif Erikson, to trace this course to these western lands. They named the Labrador and Newfoundland coast Markland. In the spring, after they had sort of settled in this area, they were able to harvest a lot of grapes, and they returned home, and they named this unknown land Vinland. They eventually built a base camp at Newfoundland in around 1000 CE. And think about that, 1000 CE compared to 1492. They had come into contact with Native Americans at this base that was built. Conflict with natives ensued, and it caused several settlers to return to Greenland. This conflict is something that we will see throughout this course. It's something that seems to happen when you have a clash of different cultures. In addition to that, you can see that a lot of the people who came to this settlement had fighting among themselves, and these different factions of settlers were fighting each other, and many were going to be killed that way. The settlement in Newfoundland probably lasted for around 10 years or so. And while the settlement wasn't permanent, and again only lasted for around 10 years, it's important for several reasons. First of all, it's the first time that Europeans are settling in North America. Whether it's successful or not, it's still lasting for 10 years, shows that the Norsemen did have a settlement and that they were persistent in staying as opposed to just coming and extracting resources. They did try to create a settlement. The second thing that it's important for is that it shows these ties and communications that happened before Columbus. In addition to that, while the settlement did not last, the Norsemen did continue to go back to Newfoundland in order to get more wood for building ships, which was very important to Viking culture, even in years to come. The next important group for us to look at are going to be the Chinese. So in the early 15th century, the Ming Dynasty in China looked like it would be the civilization to explore the world. And I'm going to say that one more time. The Ming Dynasty in China looked like it would be the civilization to explore the world, not Europeans. China had been creating settlements in parts of Asia and had dominated world trade. This means that they already had experience, they already had knowledge, and they had an understanding of how to create settlements. In addition to that, in terms of wealth, China held about 1/4 of the world's wealth, and if you add India into that equation, the region held over half of the world's wealth. So they definitely had the money to spend on boats, technology, and explorers. In the 7 state-sponsored voyages between 1405 and 1433, Admiral Jing He crossed the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. He took many voyages to East Africa, and his expeditions were massive undertakings. In the voyages that Jing He took, he often took hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors and soldiers. So you can see that between 1405 and 1433, the Chinese really are exploring, and again, on that East African coast. The expeditions are not just something haphazardly that came together. Rather, they sought to explore different trade networks and trade partners. They also wanted to collect rarities and tributes, so different items that they would consider to be very precious and valuable. And they also wanted to display Chinese power and civilization. So while we so often think about Europeans and their reasons for exploration, we can see that for the Chinese, it might be a little bit different, but somewhat similar. We can see that trade is key for both. We can see that the idea of collecting rare items and items for tribute could probably be seen in both. And the Chinese are, again, trying to display their dominance and their power. So this could also be seen later on with Europeans. Threats from both within and without in China in the 1420s led to the abandonment of the fleet in the 1430s. So, for example, China was facing issues from outside invaders like the Mongols, who seemed to be an issue. There were also Japanese pirates who were trying to take control of a lot of Chinese ships, and there was the risk of local warlords becoming more and more powerful, something that was common in Chinese history. But regardless, you're going to see the 1430s are when the Chinese really cut off touch with outsiders, but also this type of trade. In addition to that, we can see that once the Chinese stepped back, Arab merchants began taking control of trade. Thomas Benjamin, from this week's reading, argues that they too would have been capable of entering into the Atlantic. The reason lies in their motive. So China saw itself as this middle kingdom of the world. They believed that foreign lands didn't offer a lot of value. So the Chinese didn't feel the need necessarily to explore and find new lands, because to them, they weren't going to always find anything that was of value to them. They knew other places in the world had value. They did extract these rarities, but for them, it wasn't a necessity. In addition to that, you can see that Arab merchants and mariners set aside the best and most lucrative trade routes, and they already had control of those. So they didn't really have the need to find new trade routes. So if we go back to what we talked about earlier with this up here, you can see why Europe, why not China? They do not have that need for trade. Or why not the Ottomans, or why not Arabs? They also don't necessarily have that need for new trade routes. They already have goods that they need. They don't need a lot from the outside world, or in the case of the Arabs, they already control trade routes, so they don't need to get control of those. In addition to talking about the Norse and the Chinese, it's also important to talk about the Italians. Italians were traveling through the known world. The map above shows some of the city-state trade routes. In the Middle Ages, Venice and Genoa were great rivals in Mediterranean trade. Venice had mercantile colonies throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Genoese businessmen also traded with Turkish and Arab merchants for luxuries from Asia, things like spices, sugar, silk, carpets, porcelain, and more. This was because of the Pax Mongolia, which is basically the peace of the Mongols. According to the textbook, when Polo brothers of Venice traveled in the empire of the great Khan Kublai in 1261, they were given a gold tablet that served as a safe conduct pass and entitled its holder to use of roadhouses, supplies, and even escorts. This was very common among trade at the time. Because the Khans were able to ensure such great peace, it meant that the Italians were able to benefit from this peace. There is more in the reading for this week about the competition and the journeys of the Genoese and Venetians. In addition to this, the Ottomans were a growing strength as well. In 1453, they took control of Constantinople, which damaged Genoa's trading position. The straits leading into the Black Sea were largely closed to all Europeans. After the fall of Constantinople, the Turkish officials were able to cut a deal with Genoa. They permitted their ship and cargoes of Oriental goods from the colony of Pera. This, however, was also eliminated in a few decades, and the Genoese could no longer compete with the Venetians, whose colonial empire was still almost intact. In the 15th century, Italy moved into the western Mediterranean to assist the Portuguese and the Castilians in opening the Atlantic to make sugar, trade in slaves, and also to help find gold. Due to the closing of trade and the need for gold and silver, Europeans had a motive and the means to explore the Atlantic. Unlike the Chinese, Europe was divided into competitive states, and there was no central authority that could halt exploration and expansion. The motive was obvious. Italians sought profit backed by Iberian maritime endeavors, and exploration itself was relatively slow and evolutionary in nature. What's important to get out of this is, again, thinking back to this first slide that I show you, is that Europeans did have a motive. They needed to be able to trade, and they needed to get their hands on various trade items. This, again, is in contrast to the Chinese, who relatively had what they needed, and in addition to that, it's different from the Arabs or the Turks, who were able to dominate most trade routes. Something else your book really focuses on is thinking about winds and currents. The Atlantic Ocean is a little less than half of the size of the Pacific Ocean, but it is still massive in the fact that it is more than 30 million square miles. The wind flows of the Atlantic became known as the trade winds and the westerlies. They move in opposite circular patterns in the North and South Atlantic. In the north, the winds move clockwise. Catching various winds would end up helping navigators to the Americas. I have a picture above that shows you the winds in January and July to help show you how catching these trade winds would sort of help explorers to make it to the Americas. As you can see, setting off and leaving from parts of Africa and also parts of Europe could help lead different travelers into the Americas because of these winds. The Atlantic also has wind-driven currents, which are like rivers that flow through channels. The currents move clockwise in the North Atlantic and counterclockwise in the South. In time, this information was placed into maritime charts. The first manuscript charts were held as state secrets, meaning that they didn't want to share it with other Europeans because then they would let them in on these secrets. Later, however, they were printed, published, and circulated. Europeans had to learn this information through trial and error. As we'll see, especially next week when we start to look at exploration into the Atlantic and down the African coast, Europeans, a lot of what they do with these explorations is trial and error. They've never done this before. And it's hard for us to imagine a world where the other side of the world's not known. But for them, it really is trial and error and figuring out which currents will take them where, figuring out what time of year those currents are accessible, and different variables like that. Knowing the wind is very helpful. Understanding the currents is very helpful. However, without fully understanding where you are in the world, and what your latitude and longitude lines are, this would only lead to further guessing. So later on, you're going to see things like the astrobal as well as the compass that will come into play for really helping mariners really understand where they are and where they're going. In the 15th century, the Portuguese used the height of the pole star to know where they were. In the South Atlantic, they also used the Southern Cross group of stars to better know where they were. Later on, however, the Chinese who had invented the compass, they're going to be able to use that invention in order to better circulate and understand the Atlantic and how to cross it. Above, you can see a map of these various Atlantic islands that are going to be important. The book talks in particular about 3 sets of islands. So they talk about Madeira, the Canary Islands, and the Cape Verde Archipelago. For our particular purposes in this video, we're going to zoom in and look a little bit at the Canaries to better understand what's happening. So the Portuguese, again, when they start traveling, they find the Canary Islands. Some of the islands were inhabited and could be raided for slaves, which was an early source of profit. The Canaries also produced useful products, primarily dyestuffs. In addition to that, you can see that later on, after the Black Death, the Portuguese and Europeans from many nations mined the native population of the Canaries for slaves in sugar plantations in Cyprus, Sicily, and Madeira. In 1404, Portugal granted Giovanni de Parma of Genoa a royal license to establish a sugar plantation and to use the local ganache labor, so using the primary labor there as slaves. This is important to understand. From here, we can see that plantation systems are going to be set up in order to extract as much wealth from the land as possible. While they didn't find things like gold and spices, they did find people that they could force into labor, and they did find land that was suitable to sugar. So we can see that with the Canary Islands. To tell you more about the sugar, as what would happen in Madeira, Genoese capital underwrote settlement and financed agricultural development in the Canary Islands. Sugar was introduced in the 1480s, and production there was soon rivaled to that of Madeira. Natives were enslaved to work the plantations, despite Queen Isabel's prohibition of Canarian slavery. As in Madeira, Africans eventually became the predominant slave population. Portugal and Castile's first overseas colonies were great successes with Canarian and African slavery. Later, you also see that Prince Henry the Navigator also really wanted the Canaries, and one reason why it was so important is not only because of the slaves and sugar, but also because Portugal starts to see the Canary Islands as this sort of gateway to having access to the African coast and to gold. So you can see the Canary Islands are here, and they see it as this way of being able to tap into the gold trade that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. But regardless, your book talks more in depth about the 2 other islands that are listed up here, but hopefully that helps to better understand where they are first settling and what they are doing there. So as we come to a close for the lecture section of this video, I just wanted to bring your attention back to this particular slide. Why Europe? So first of all, it faces the Atlantic. If we look at this map right here, you can see that Europe faces into the Atlantic, and of course these trade winds and currents are going to help them to explore the Atlantic. And when we say the Atlantic, remember that we're not just talking about the Americas, we're also talking about these various islands off the coast of Africa, as well as Africa itself. In addition to that, there is a need for trade. As I have mentioned several times, the Chinese and Arabs did not necessarily feel the need to find new trade routes. Either they already had sufficient goods in their own lands, or they dominated the trade that already existed and they didn't need access to new trade routes. For Europeans, because of the Ottomans and because of the tightening of trade in places like China, they're starting to see that they are not always necessarily able to take control of trade like they once had with the Italians. And in addition to that, you can see that places like Europe and France are not going to be tapped into that trade to begin with. So they do need better trade partners and trade routes. We also talked about Europeans having access to new types of technology. This technology includes things like maritime charts. These charts help to better chart the winds and thus helping people to travel easier. We also see that things like the Chinese compass are very important for better being able to navigate in these waters. Something else that we haven't talked about are the printing presses. Once these maritime charts are made, they have to be printed, and when they are printed, this press is going to help to circulate information, not only charts, but also just news of different discoveries, and news of what worked and what didn't work is going to travel much quicker because of it. So with that, we can also see that in Europe, there is no one central authority to halt explorations like what we saw in places like China. So because the Chinese wanted to stop this exploration, they were able to do so. But in Europe, you have many different competitive city-states that are going to compete with one another for trade, and because of that, trade will not be halted. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Again, for this week, we've looked a little bit into the past, thinking about the Norse and the Chinese, and we've also talked about the Italians and late medieval trade routes. In addition to that, we talked about technology, as well as what happens in the near Atlantic. And what happens in this near Atlantic, as we will talk about in the coming weeks, really sets the stage for what will happen in the further Atlantic, in the not so near Atlantic. So please keep all of that in mind as we move forward. Switch gears for a second, and we're going to look at your assessment for the week. As always, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the short answer questions. One thing I would like to remind you is to please be sure that with the short answer questions that you are answering them completely. Make sure that you give enough detail in each of your answers in order to receive full credit. As always, the page numbers are also listed to help you with your response. So the first question here is to analyze the explorations of the Norse and Chinese. What types of discoveries did they make and why were they possible? Where and what impact did they have on the world? So really thinking about what happens with the Norse and the Chinese like we talked about. The next question here, question 3, is going to deal with the second section you have in your reading today. So there were many economic scholars that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries who tried to better understand economics and Europe's expansion. According to this week's reading, most scholars have argued that capitalism in one form or another was both a cause and a consequence of expansion, overseas trade, and colonization. So the question I have for you is to really unpack what that statement means. Who were some of the economic scholars who tackled this idea? Who were the Weberians, the Marxist and neo-Marxist, and how did their analysis of economic changes differ? So really dealing with a section we didn't talk about in this particular lecture video, but that is present in your textbook. The next question that you're going to have to answer for this week is based on section 3. So section 3 of this week's reading focuses on how technology and new knowledge helped Europeans to expand into the Atlantic. Analyze these advancements. How were Europeans better understanding wind currents and oceanic rivers? What types of technology were used or created? So thinking about the creation of those maritime maps we talked about and the use of Chinese technology, things like the compass. The next question you have here deals with pages 71 through 75, and it is going to ask you to analyze the earliest exploration of Europeans, really thinking about places like the Canary Islands that we talked about today. What islands were explored, what types of goods were extracted, and further, what types of people, crops, and animals were introduced to the islands. The last question that you're going to have for this week is using the entire reading, so there's no page numbers given, but using the entire reading, analyze this early European exploration. Why Europeans and why at this moment in history? What technology aided Europeans in their journey? Who were some of the main countries involved, and what were they seeking to gain? As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. I'm always happy to help. And otherwise, I hope you have a great week, and I will talk with you in the next video.